Hello and welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. After a few-week hiatus, I'm still Sean McKinda.
And I'm still Jackson Keller.
And we are back with a new schedule. First and foremost, we're going to be doing more of a bi-weekly release from this point forward due to various prior commitments. So expect a little bit of a looser schedule, but we'll keep up with the solid content.
Yes, it'll be just as good, but a little less frequently. So make sure you guys stay tuned in. Of course, you can follow any and all updates on our Twitter at BADH_cast.
With that, though, let's talk about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
I have waited so long for this moment. The cycle is complete.
We are returning at what is clearly Jackson's behest to JoJo. Previously, we did Phantom Blood. If you haven't listened to that episode, it is like a couple months back at this point. And now that we have a little bit of a dead zone for the movies, we've returned to talk about Battle Tendencies, which another favorite of Jackson's. So,
yes, this was my favorite part of JoJo. I have since caught up on the manga, and it's probably been overtaken by Part 7. But this is still very near and dear to my heart. This is my first time revisiting Battle Tendency since I first watched it. And the first time I watched it, this is the part that made me a JoJo fan. I was a little iffy on Phantom Blood, but Phantom Blood has since kind of grown on me a little bit more. But at the time, I was like, well, I like this relationship they got going on between Jonathan and Dio. But the rest of it, I'm not really sure about. The middle part was kind of slow. Then I started Battle Tendency and was just entranced from the first wacky plan that our new glorious asshole protagonist, Joseph Joestar, concocts all the way until the absolutely ludicrous finale. I just thought it was a ton of fun. I thought the pacing was a little bit better. I didn't... despite being longer, the story beats flowed a little bit better for me. Characters were a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more memorable, especially the protagonist. Just all around a good time, Battle Tendency, in my humble opinion. And I basically walked away from this second viewing affirmed with what I liked about it, but then maybe also reminded of some of the things that we would be remiss to ignore, shall we say, about Battle Tendency.
There's some problems. That being said, I had basically the exact opposite reaction of Jackson. I watched Phantom Blood, thought it was the most batshit crazy thing I had ever watched, got really jazzed by the opening and everything like that, got really excited to watch the whole thing. And then it switched to Battle Tendency. I watched maybe an episode or two and then kind of went, I'm good, and put it down. So this was actually my first real viewing of it. I've seen parts of it on Toonami with the sub where they have the voice actor who played Nigel Uno from Codename Kids Next Door playing JoJo, which... holy shit, is that the best fit I've ever seen. It was so good.
He actually does a spectacular job. He nails exactly what I would want out of an English dub of Joseph.
Yeah, it is one of the few times I will say, go check out the dub. It is worth it just for JoJo's voice actor. He's fantastic. Ultimately, though, I came away really enjoying Battle Tendency. I don't really know what about it put me off the first time, but it didn't do it to me a second time, and I kept with it and definitely enjoyed it. I thought the ending was very solid, probably my favorite moment of this arc. There was some cool character development, some funny moments, and some enjoyable keikakus. So,
So many keikakus.
For what it's worth, keikaku does mean plan. So.
For those of you who missed our Death Note episode. I think the thing that I like most about Battle Tendency outside of... Joseph probably is my favorite JoJo. And It's got a lot of style. It's got a lot of flair. It feels like he knows what he wants to do with the story a little bit more. In Phantom Blood, he was still very obviously finding his feet, and
He
I
being
think
the author, I'm assuming.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, Hirohiko Araki, the author of the manga. I mean, Phantom Blood, both were consistently like good adaptations, but as far as like the core story, I think just like seeing how there's a lot more cleverness to the fights. I mean, not that the plans are always feasible or solid, but they are like consistently, mostly consistently. There are some parts where it's a little too obvious that Joseph is, but actually I've done all of this. Your next line is herpadur. It's not always funny every time. But overall like the approach to combat in this plays to his strengths as a writer and as an artist a little bit more than kind of the muscle boy, like stand around, take a lot of punishment and punch of Phantom Blood. And I think he really finds more of an identity here, like with his voice as like a manga author. A lot of what's enjoyable about JoJo, what would kind of make it this incredibly strange institution of the anime world, I think really starts here, and then kind of becomes solidified in parts 3 and 4. So,
as someone who has watched parts 1 and 2 and never touched the manga, yeah, I understand what you are saying and totally agree. I have no idea what he's talking about.
I just have to expound upon the lore and the legacy of JoJo whenever I get the chance, okay? Actually, this is a true story. There was a class. There was a class that I took one time where we had to do this really dry reading about like the history of the alphabet and how it compared to like hieroglyphs. Very, very boring. So we had to, of course it was a class, we had to like make a reading response about it. And literally when I was thinking about the history of like the alphabet versus the history of like writing inspired by like the Chinese writing system, I thought of JoJo and how Dio is always spelled with English letters, and immediately wrote like a page and a half about how the reading related to how the author of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure spelled his villain's name. So this is how much JoJo has consumed my thoughts. Someone please help me. Someone put me down. I cannot be allowed.
The fact that this man did not fail out of college based on his amount of writing on anime and video game is still astounding to me. I lived with him and I am just shocked.
Well, apparently I write about anime and video games very well. So.
With the public humiliation of Jackson out of the way, we're going to slide into spoilers and start talking about some of the people who died and some of the people who maybe could have dealt with dying a bit earlier.
So, the beginning of Battle Tendency, I think, is really clever in a lot of ways. A little bit weird in some others, but in general, one of the strengths of Battle Tendency, as far as its structure and its pacing, is that unlike other JoJo parts, which later on tend to be more like Monster of the Week, episodic, like individual wacky stand battles without that much of a progression, what Battle Tendency does really well is create this sense of escalation, that we're starting from, one place with this sort of thing, and then by the end, crazy stuff is happening, and we haven't really been lost around the way. I think the part is good at balancing wackiness and, like, very, very, like, wacky individual plot moments, but still stringing it together with a coherent story and characters that, again, are still sort of simple, but, like, their arcs make sense, and it's the glue that holds the wackiness together. And I think one of the things that Araki does at the beginning by having Strizo, the one of the Hamon masters, one of the Hamon disciples from part 1, show up and attack Joseph as a vampire. One thing it does really well is give us an opponent who is in most ways comparable to Dio, like at least in terms of his powers. Like he very explicitly uses Dio's main power set. And by having Joseph pretty much just totally clown on him, it creates a very good baseline for, okay, like this is the villain that took an entire arc to beat last time. Like the entire quest was about putting Dio down. And now we have this character who's just as powerful, but Joseph deals with him in 2 episodes. So how are things going to get worse? How are we going to escalate the threat? I think then that with the introduction of the Pillarmen, who we'll talk about a little bit in a bit more detail later, I think that Araki does this very well of having this escalation of a threat that doesn't feel, and it feels natural to me. It doesn't feel like we've gone so far off the rails with like the power creep. Like that's something that like Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball is often brought up as kind of a contrast. It's kind of, it and JoJo are kind of yin and yang in a lot of ways. But in Dragon Ball, we have the power creep starts from like martial arts wackiness at the beginning, to Piccolo blowing up a city, to Vegeta blowing up a planet, to Cell blowing up a solar system, and then by the time we get to Dragon Ball Super, they're like destroying universes, and it's just gone like completely insane. Like they have no other way to make the threat any more intimidating aside from just increasing the size of the celestial body that they can destroy. But with this, that progression of escalation, with how much the villains can do, how intimidating they are, it feels right. It feels correct. It feels like a good and proper sequel to Phantom Blood.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you on that. I felt, I think if I had watched this in the like rapid succession, I would have been more blown away by how impressive it is that JoJo the Second took out Straizo so quickly. It works really well as kind of a shock moment, like, oh shit, that's where we're at now. Like that was surprisingly easy, and it also serves as the introduction to JoJo of there are threats bigger than I, which it works really seamlessly. Like it just feels very normal. Like nothing about it feels like overblown. It's very good, I guess, for lack of a better word. Like it works really well. And as Jackson said, unlike Dragon Ball Z, which just keeps getting bigger and bigger, it feels like taking a step as opposed to just jumping off the stairwell.
Yeah, and I think the way that Joseph takes him out, too, the fact that there is so much emphasis placed on his trickery. We get a very clear introduction to his little, your next line is gimmick, and the fact that he's got all these wacky plans that are just completely impossible, like would never work. But as far as distinguishing him from Jonathan, who is very much just, again, take all the punishment that you can and then punch them even harder, it serves as a very effective contrast from his grandfather. And also morally, I like that the contrast is clearly something that Araki's got on his mind. It's like he's clearly trying to take what we know and expect about Phantom Blood and turn it around a little bit and change the situation. So the fact that Straizo predicts that Joseph will be as noble as Jonathan and will be caught in a tricky bind by holding this woman hostage, and since Joseph's a complete dick, he's just like, I've never met this woman in my life. Like, I don't give a fuck. It's a good little moment, even though Joseph maybe, and I think it ends up being a good little arc for Joseph in the long run, like starting from that point and just him being kind of an asshole clown, is sort of discovering that maybe he has more of his grandfather in him that he cares to admit. Like having more moments of him being more of a hero while also having those bits of selfishness to keep him distinct from both his grandfather and the other characters going forward, the other characters around him too.
Plus, and this is just kind of a minor thing, it does show that despite technology evolving, we still, as a human species, have not developed a weapon to kill these vampires easily. Like, he immediately whips out a machine gun and lays into him, and he's fine. He blows him up with, like, 15 hand grenades, and he's fine. It works really well as a visual cue to say, hey, we've progressed, but it doesn't matter. They're still a threat to us. My biggest complaint with the whole scene, though, is that it felt really weird that it was Straight-So, because I had never really gotten a malicious intent from Straight-So either of the past 2 times I had watched Phantom Blood. So for him to just be like, JK, I have a craving for immortality and want to be young, and I'm here to fuck your shit up so I can be young forever. Okay, cool. Was just really, really weird. He never really felt like anything to me.
Well, the problem with Straight-So is that he's a character that literally only exists so Hirohiko Araki can make a reference to a rock band. Because there was a character named Dyer, who, if you don't remember, it's okay, everyone forgets Dyer, only showed up to use this stupid crotch attack and die. Obviously, if you're going to have Dyer, you can't have the reference to Dire Straits unless you have Straits following him, so we needed Straight-So. But he didn't do anything in Phantom Blood, really. He just stood in the background and, punched the horde of zombies while Jonathan and Dio had their little spat. I mean, really, it's just kind of a side effect of, like, if you weren't Jonathan, Dio, Speedwagon, and, like, Zappelli, like, you didn't matter in part 1. Arena mattered a little bit, I guess. But so I get wanting to have the shock of, a character who was an old ally come back and, actually have these malicious feelings. I can see how that would have worked, but we never... Again, Straight-So's not really a character in part 1, so the fact that he's suddenly evil, raises some questions and does feel a little bit strange. But
that would be kind of like having the shock of, like, a villager he saved at one point come back and be like, haha, just kidding, I'm evil now. Okay, who gives a shit? You were just some dude in the background. Good for you.
It'd be like if the kid that, actually, the kid in part 1 that Jonathan, like, rescues from the village, like, he had more screen time and presence than Straight-So did. That would almost make more sense to have the kid come back. I was going to use the
kid as an example, but then I thought about it and went, no, I think that would make more sense. So, I have no idea why they chose Straight-So, especially because, and this is my own just little personal pet theory, they could have used the zombie vampire that killed George later on in the explanation to come and be like, I found the mask, or I want to find the mask and I need to kill the remaining Joestars, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like, it's a thin theory to get Straight-So there. Why not have a thin theory to get Zombie 72B there? And it would require some working around with why George was gone, but I mean, maybe George was in the Amazon who found the fucking first Pillarmen, and that's why he died or disappeared or whatever. Like, it wouldn't have been hard to make it work. So I don't know. It just, the fact that it's Straight-So is odd to me. It's a pretty non-issue, all things considered, but it bothered me.
Yeah, it is strange that he's suddenly such an important character because he's kind of Lisa's dad, too. So he ends up being really important here, but he was far from being the most
Anything?
important character in yeah, like he was barely a character. He showed up just so, like, honestly, you could have just had the plot be Jonathan fights Dio at the top of the tower and only Speedwagon is around, and nothing about that last fight would have changed. So yeah, but a relatively small gripe though.
Oh, absolutely. So now that we've mentioned Pillarmen multiple times, I know that we have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion we'd like to have in regards to them, and that was a terrible transition. No, go ahead. I'm going to leave that in. Fuck it.
Fuck it. Yeah, so the Pillarmen, here's the thing about the Pillarmen, is that I think the Pillarmen might be Araki's weakest villains. And it is a testament to how talented he is at writing villains with charisma and presence that they still end up being extremely memorable. And I've been trying to think about why that is. Because as far as, like, personalities go, they aren't necessarily that interesting or that deep or anything. Like, they're not even as charismatic as Dio was, for certain. But there's something about them that just makes them feel intimidating, makes them feel important. I mean, part of that is just their designs. Like, as ridiculous as, like, these half-naked, like, 5/6, like, naked, big, like, muscle men are, like, it does a good job of, like, seeming like the peak of, like, kind of human-like life. Like, you look at them and you know that those are not guys you want to mess with. And there's a lot of other stuff about them too, and I think part of that is just that they end up creating this almost this sense of mythology. As silly as it is, the fact that these are beings that are, like, millennia, they've been around for millennia, like, encased in stone. They created the stone mask, which is, you know, the source of literally all the strife in the plot that we are going to see in parts 3, 4, 5, and 6. Literally everything can connect back to the moment when Dio puts on the stone mask. So, like, the fact that we see the creators, that could have been a really, like, lame thing. Like, it could have felt really cheap. It could have felt, like, just a rehash of Dio. But I think the fact that, like, just from their power set and their abilities, that you look at them and there's not a doubt in your mind that, like, if Dio were still around, like, these guys would eat him for breakfast, literally. And he was our big bad last time. And there are 4 of them, and we start off with basically, like, the baby. I like that reveal a lot too, and that's having Santana show up and be sort of the one being researched, having him seem like such a big, like, important threat that Joseph and the gang, like, barely deal with. And then having the reveal of, like, hey, so there are 3 more, and they look way worse than this one did. Just really goes a long way in having that escalation. The thing about Battle Tendency is that it feels almost Indiana Jones to me. Like, if you asked, like, a crazy person to make Indiana Jones, like, this is what you would get. And so the way the, like, adventure sort of, like, flows from one point into another, and we get all these, like, globe-trotting locales, and the situation's kind of always changing. It's sort of one of the things that I love about it. I think the way the Pillarmen are introduced. I mean, oh god, their introduction scene, just the gore when Wamu ties all those dudes together and, like, sucks them all up with his vampire, like, drinking. It's just magnificent. Like, the gore in this show is a delight, a consistent delight. And then after we see that, the other two just pop out of the wall and they pose, and it's the most JoJo moment of all time, I think, that introduction scene to the Pillarmen, and the fact that they get such a grand reveal, I think, goes a long way in giving them this presence. Despite having pretty like standard villain personalities, like the honorable one, the arrogant one, and like the calculating leader boy. I don't want to get like too far off the rails here, but I think that each Pillarman getting his own time in the sun before Car certainly gets his time in the sun. I think the fact that we spend a decent amount of time with each one, and the fact that they interact with each other in a way that no other set of JoJo villains really does. Because most JoJo villains, you have the character who is clearly the boss, clearly the leader, and then you have his subordinates that will attack the Joestars, attack their friends, like one at a time as stand users later on in part 3 onwards, and then Dio and his zombies earlier. But the thing about the Pillarmen is that I think by having 3 of them, because when I think about like the main villains in the series, I never think about just cars. I always think about them as a unit, and I think the fact that they have this kind of camaraderie with each other, and you can sense that like when one of them goes down, like the other ones have like a very specific reaction to it. Like Wamu is very like pissed off, and Cars like he sort of ends up having this little fight with Cars because Cars wants to take the practical route, but Wamu doesn't want to dishonor AC/DC. And the fact they kind of fight about it gives them a little something as compared to just like part 3 Dio, for example, who we only ever really see interacting with 1 or 2 characters. And the fact that you expect them to go down a certain way, you expect them to die a certain way, that we have our training arc with Joseph and Caesar. They're our heroes. There are 3 Pillarmen. One of them is clearly the boss of the other 2. So, it makes sense that we'll have our 2-on-2 battle with a newly revived Joseph and Caesar after, getting knocked down, after getting, kind of owned by them in the opening segment. And they'll come back, they'll kill AC/DC and Wamu, and then they'll move on to Cars. And that's sort of how you expect things to go. The fact that AC/DC shows up in the middle of their training arc and like enacting his plan, basically like trying to further the goals of the Pillarmen, it's a bit of a surprising moment. Like you're not expecting him to show up when he does, and so it sort of disrupts you after feeling a little bit safe while Caesar and Joseph train with Lisa, and really forces them to immediately like use these skills that they've gained. And I've seen some complaints that maybe they wish Joseph hadn't taken all of them out. Like the story is a little too Joseph centered. And I don't really agree with that, just because I like the way that it ends up playing out. I think even though he doesn't win, Caesar's fight with Wamu is spectacular in its own right, and I really like the chariot battle that he has with Joseph, and kind of that little moment of respect that they end up having for one another. And then, of course, like, it wouldn't be satisfying if not the main character ended up dealing with Cars. So, I don't know. I think as far as, like, when they die in the story and the fact that Joseph kills them all, well, he doesn't kill Cars. But the fact that it's the Joseph Joestar show doesn't really bother me, because I like Joseph Joestar.
I'm going to interject really quick just to say that I think Cars' death has got to be one of the most metal, disturbing deaths I have ever witnessed.
It's so good. It's so good.
It's absurd. If you don't know and don't care to be spoiled on it, he gets launched into space, which is not an unheard of death. And
well, let's back up. Because what's important to know at this point is that Cars has succeeded in his goals. He has obtained the stone. He put on the mask. He has now conquered the sun and seemingly cannot be killed. Sean, tell us how he's taken care of.
He is launched into space via volcano, and JoJo's hand by pure dumb luck, and a bunch of rocks by pure dumb luck, and is, I was expecting him to have to be spaced, for lack of a better word, and he is, for good reason. What I was not expecting was for him to not die in space, but instead to freeze and essentially return to Pillarman state. And as even stated, he continues to drift through space, neither man nor mineral, or both man and mineral, which is
he
dark.
Wishes for death, but there was nothing that could kill him.
It's dark in and of itself, and the line that stuck out beyond all of the others was, he simply stopped thinking. That is so disturbing to me. I love it.
Cars gets it so bad, and I actually had a small debate with my girlfriend, and it wasn't much of a debate because she was totally right. Is that my first thought was that like Cars got it so much worse than Dio did, and Cars was not like nearly as bad. But then she pointed out. She was like, yes, he was. Like, what are you talking about? Like, he was way worse than Dio. And I'm like, what do you, like, really? Like, I don't know what you mean. And then she reminded me, because it's sort of glossed over, the fact that the Pillarmen used to be, like, the dominant species, and Cars, because of his dispute with them, like, ended up massacring them all. So Cars, like, succeeded in literal genocide, but that's not the thing about him that tends to stick out. Like, watching it as far as, like, your moral, like, sense, like, Dio still ends up seeming worse. Even when you look at it, like, his actions, like, he didn't succeed in, like, completing full genocide like Cars did. I mean, he intended to. But the fact that we get that, like, really personal, like, Dio burning the dog, and with Cars, we get that specific contrast where he saves the dog from the, like, he clearly has some value for life that isn't human life. That's actually why it pisses me off a little bit when he kills that squirrel. That feels like a inconsistency that sort of bugs me, but it's not really that important. So the fact that, Cars gets it so bad, it's like he deserves it, but it doesn't really register with you as much, just because his, like, greatest act of villainy is something that kind of happens in the backstory and isn't something that he does to JoJo. Like, yes, he betrays, like, Wamu's memory, and he's, like, cunning and crafty, but, you could say that's just him, like, trying to achieve his, like, he was ruthless, but it's not like sadism like Dio was. So then the fact that he gets it so bad, I mean, it's amazing. It's perfect.
It's absurd. It is dark. It is lovely. As I said, it was far more upsetting than I would expect it to be. It was, for a silly show that is JoJo, this was very, very dark. And I guess to some extent I should have expected it just from Dio's death, because that's also pretty insane. Like, being condemned to an underwater prison is just as ridiculous, but I don't know, something about this one just took me completely aback by how hardcore it was.
I think the best thing about the Cars floating through space thing is that somehow it's not even the worst death in the series. Everyone who has read Part 5 knows exactly what I am talking about. You
keep taunting me with this, and I don't want you to spoil it, but I'm very curious.
If you ever end of like reading the manga, you are in for something fucked. Before we move on from Cars and the Pillarmen, did it bother you that the fact that he basically just beat Cars by complete luck? Did that bother you? I'm curious.
It did, actually. I thought when Stroheim showed up on the pontoon, I thought it was dumb and silly, but I'm like, all right, fuck it. I'm just going to accept it. Let's just roll with it. When not Stroheim's hand, but JoJo's hand did the exact same thing as Stroheim's hand on the plane, I'm like, what the fuck is happening here? Why is this happening? I figured they could have chalked it up to the stone, because like they talk about how the Aja stone channels Hamon, and I'm like, all right, cool. Maybe, it repairs JoJo, or it lets him use his body parts from a distance, like it let the Pillarmen. And instead, it's just like, nah, he got lucky, and for whatever reason, the explosion of a volcano launched his hand hard enough to lodge itself in Car's throat. Sure. Okay. Let's let that happen. Fine. Good enough. He gets pummeled by rocks, and that's what brings him to escape velocity. It is such a wild chain of events for someone who is normally so calculating. It was so bizarre.
See, I respect that, but I kind of love this ending, and I don't think I would change a thing about it. I think the fact, because Araki's sort of famous for his ass pulls, not so much in part 1, but like every other part in the ending has some sort of bullshit like this. What I like about part 2's ending, this blatant, which I will fully admit is like a blatant Deus Ex Machina. Like there has never been a purer example of Deus Ex Machina than this. I just love how, part 2 just goes for it, man. Like, when it does something, it does it all the way. And the fact that he clearly rode himself into a corner by making Cars so strong, like having him be able to use Hamon, having him, be able to turn into any animal, having him be able to regenerate from anything. Araki clearly did not know how to resolve this situation. So the fact that he literally had him shoot out of a volcano into space, and even then had to conjure some bullshit to explain why Cars would be shot into space and not JoJo, because I think the stupider thing, the most baffling thing, isn't that Cars get shot into space by complete luck. I kind of like that, Joseph Joestar, the trick master, Cars is like, is this all part of your plan? And JoJo's like, I had you in my trap the whole time. And in his mind, he's just like, this was complete luck. I think that's hilarious.
No, I appreciated that. I thought that was a really solid gag for the end and everything. It just overall felt bizarre.
Yeah. But then so what's even sillier is that, we see that shot of Joseph on the rock, in the exosphere or whatever. And he falls and he survives. How did he survive that?
I just chalked that up to Jotaro luck, so.
No, it's
Joestar luck, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Joestar. It's funny that there's clearly this Joestar ass pull luck, but at least a lot of the Joestars are not lucky men. Jonathan wasn't, George wasn't. So it's I don't know. But at that point, pretty much my feeling on the ending is that I'm already along for the ride with all the bullshit. Clearly, what I appreciate about Battle Tendency's attitude is that it's self-aware enough that it knows it's silly and that it knows it's stupid. But it still tries to have like this adventure story narrative around it. So it's not like constantly. It's a weird balance, because if you have something that's too self-aware, that's constantly like pointing and laughing at itself and not just allowed to exist, then it stops being funny. It stops being enjoyable. It ends up being like Birdemic 2, like with zombies and shit. And that's no fun. But Battle Tendency, I feel like, is the perfect balance of silliness that is allowed to just be silly without regard for logic. Like, Araki is clearly doing what's gonna be cool, like what's gonna be fun. But even so, there are still moments where there's still like some decent enough like character work going on. Like, we want to talk about another death. Caesar's death is maybe the best example of this.
I was just going to say, it works really well as both something that's kind of tongue-in-cheek and yet plays it very seriously and works really well.
Yeah, like, it really... Like, you feel that loss when he's gone. Like, he had a little... I've seen accusations that, like, as a side character, like, Caesar is too boring to leave an impact. But I feel like you get... even though his time in the show is pretty brief, I feel like you get enough of an idea of, like, what his relationship with JoJo is like and, like, how they sort of play off of each other. And I think they build a decent amount of camaraderie in, like, that short amount of time. So when he dies, like, his loss is felt in the story. But also, like, the scene is hamming it up. Like... Joseph is screaming his name, and the cross, and like this cross-shaped slab falls on him, and there's the opera music in the background, and it's just like completely over the top, and yet somehow like leaves a lot more of an impact. I guess like this is the sort of thing I wanted from fittingly enough from the previous Zeppeli's death scene. Like we talked about in our Phantom Blood episode, how that didn't really land with us. It felt more like typical, like kind of Obi-Wan mentor death. This one stands out a little bit more as a memorable scene. I think partially because like it's not afraid to just be itself and go for it,
Yeah, it really pulls no punches. It lets itself be a clear Christ analogy, and the battle setup to it is really nice. It's really well executed. I thought there was a lot of really interesting ideas, and I think that it plays well where the original Zeppeli just falls incredibly flat, because I feel like Zeppeli just kind of goes meanwhile Caesar goes out like a motherfucking badass and just gives it his all and has a brilliant plan that ends up just falling short because of a simple miscalculation. And that makes sense to me. And his redeeming, like, all right, I need to make sure that someone else lives is really, it makes sense within the story. I think it works just much better than his grandfather's death.
Yeah, for certain. And I think even like in the character's like reaction to the death, like I think part of the problem with Zeppeli 1's death is that, like, the characters just sort of move on. Like, no time to waste. We gotta go fight Dio. And, he's not, Zeppeli, who, that's not that important anymore. With Caesar, like, in the scene itself, like, I really like the touch of, like, Lisa, like, trying to keep cool, but, like, she's accidentally, trying to smoke the wrong end of the cigarette. And even just, like, the imagery of the headband. Like, Joseph, when he's drawn in, like, promotional material in the games, like, he's always wearing Caesar's headband. It's become associated with him. And the fact that, like, he uses it to kill Wamu in the end, like, it ends up being part of his grand scheme. Like, that was a great touch. Like, he doesn't wear the headband for too long. It's only the span of, like, a couple episodes. But the fact that he keeps it as, like, this memento and, like, him putting it on is sort of, like, Joseph's signature moment, both for his, like, arc as a character and also just, like, as an image, what we refer to. Like, the intro to Part 3, when Joseph is featured in it, like, it's him putting on the headband. It's always about the headband. So the fact that, like, even though the scene is, like, big and melodramatic and over the top, like, the fact that Caesar's death has more of a tangible impact on the story and on the characters, I think also gives it a bit more of an impact than, our very, very stock, very tropey death of Zeppeli Sr.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to continue with our grand tradition, of course, and dive into the heavy stuff. Granted, this week it is at least a little bit lighter, but we are still talking about Nazis. Mainly in kind of some questions we have about how Japan might have taught World War II, as well as some of the way that this show just treats Nazis. It's weird.
Yeah, so Battle Tendency's got a weird relationship with Nazis, and this is not a new observation. I had heard that like this show was a little too buddy-buddy with the Nazis, even before I watched it. Which is strange, because when they're introduced, the Nazis are playing the role you would exactly expect them to in this kind of story. Like, they're the one,
they are Wolfenstein Nazis.
Yeah, they're playing God, they're running experiments on Santana, they're trying to wake him up. It's exactly what you'd expect so far, so good. Joseph has a moment where he questions if, even though maybe Stroheim's a bad guy, like maybe he's not that bad of a guy, and that's questionable, but you can at least see, at least in that moment, like Stroheim is like trying to stop Santana and like jumping on the grenade, so to speak, and you can see how like maybe the attempt, ill-advised as it is, to humanize a Nazi, like you can see why it's being done as like a beat for the story and the character. The story continues, though, and the characters only ever get more buddy-buddy with the Axis powers. Caesar, of course, is Italian. Italy was up to its own fascism back at this time, of course. It's the OG fascist, in fact, and he's got this friend who's also a Nazi, who has like a locket with his little Nazi girlfriend in it, and he's talking about how he can't wait to go home to her, and Caesar has like a big meltdown when Wamu absorbs the guy. And also weird, but I mean, the fact that Caesar's Italian, when you know that Hirohiko Arki's got a big like fascination with Italy, it makes more sense. At the time, you're still questioning like why we're hanging out with the Axis powers so much still. Not that there's any indication that like Caesar's a fascist, but again, it has now become a trend. We have now humanized a Nazi twice. Then you keep going. Stroheim comes back and he's a robot, and he's got a big goofy machine gun, and like the scene is mostly played for laughs, and you know what? Fine. Really, the biggest problem comes in, like, that seals the deal, like 3 strikes and you're out, is at the very end when the Nazis show up as like the big heroes who have like UV like shoulder lamps to disintegrate Kars' zombie army. And not only that, but they've been funded by Speedwagon, like, who until this point has been the like purest, like noblest soul in the series aside from Jonathan. What the fuck, Speedwagon? Why are you funding the Nazis?
Yeah, that was kind of when I actually paused the episode, went, hang on a second, am I getting this right? Is Speedwagon funding the Nazis? And I'm pretty sure I actually rewound it to make sure that I read the sub right. And yep, Speedwagon's like, yeah, I helped the Nazis, I gave them money so we could build this. It's for the greater good and everything, but you just gave money to Nazis.
And it's not like Speedwagon doesn't have his own, like, minions that he could outfit this technology with. He didn't have to give it to the Nazis. There were other options. Yeah, so this is this is a problem. Problematic, you might even say, to say the least. And the thing I'm wondering is that as it stands, I mean, the show, it's hard for me to say this in the current era where we have, like, Richard Spencer as a fucking political force. But, you know, it's hard to, like, it's weird and uncomfortable, but I don't, like, feel that genuinely disturbed by the presence of all the Nazis in this. I mean, I'm sure that, like, there are people who would feel much more differently about that, especially now. But mostly what it makes me think about is why. Like, I'm more curious because I don't, you know, maybe this is me being charitable, but, like, my gut says that I don't think Hirohiko Araki is, like, a full-blown fascist. Like, I don't think his intention was to support Nazism here. And really, it just makes me wonder, as, you know, Sean sort of alluded to earlier, what the Japanese education system was like back when Araki would have been in school. Because if you think about it, he was in his 20s when he wrote this, and that was back in, like, the 80s, so he probably grew up in, like, the 60s, you know, give or take. Not too long after World War II, a war in which, of course, Japan allied with the Nazis and did a lot of, had their own hefty list of war crimes to account for. So, and then I remember a little while back reading about this weird line in Metal Gear Solid 2 that references textbooks, and apparently part of the point of that game was to address controversy that was going on in Japanese schools at the time, where they would downplay Japan's crimes during World War II, like Nanking, all of that stuff, like just their affiliation with the Nazis, like just completely sort of swept under the rug to try and preserve their, like, cultural self-image. So I'm just sort of wondering, like, if this is just a product of how Araki would have been taught World War II. And, you know, I've got no way to prove this either way. Like, maybe they went really hard in schools on the Nazis being bad and, you know, to try and atone. That's possible too. But I don't know. Something tells me this weird humanization of Nazis is not so much about sweeping their crimes under the rug. It feels more like genuine ignorance to me. Like, this point of view that maybe he grew up being taught that even though these war crimes were committed, like, the Nazis were just another opposing army in a war. I could totally see that being the case if it meant, like, especially because Japan as a culture is, like, seems to be overwhelmingly about, like, kind of preserving this dignity, like, this sense of dignity and, like, this contribution to the community. Like, I'm sure the fact that, you know, wrestling with all these war crimes would be a big blow to that, and the fact that they were buddying with the Nazis. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if growing up he had not a great idea of, like, what the full extent of the Nazis' crimes were. So I guess that's my big caveat to, you know, whether or not to watch Battle Tendency. Normally I would just heartily recommend it, but I mean, yes, there is some Nazi apologism in here, so oh boy.
It kind of ultimately to me feels like it falls on the whole there's good people on both sides type of argument. Because JoJo, as we've mentioned, says, like, well, he's a bad guy, but maybe he's not a bad guy, which, you know, besides being Zangief's line from Wreck-It Ralph, is kind of the idea of find people on both sides. So it's weird. It's enjoyable for everything that it is. Just, I mean, I don't want to say don't think too hard about it, because I think everyone should think hard about this and about what it might be potentially presenting. But I'm kind of falling with Jackson that I don't necessarily know how intended it was, because there's not a whole lot of Nazi sympathy outside of that. It's kind of like just as one platoon.
I think it's even weirder because, again, when the Nazis are introduced, they're very clearly playing the villainous role. So, like, I don't know, it's just strange. Like, it's just baffling, really. JoJo is definitely no stranger to hashtag problematic elements. Honestly, the fact that the Nazi apologism might not even be, like, socially the worst thing about the whole series.
No, the treatment of women in this show is so bad.
Ooh, it's bad.
Yeah, you go into this show with a big grain of salt. There's a certain amount of enjoyment to be had, but you need to know what you're getting into.
Yeah, and the thing is too, it is an old series. That's easy to forget because this is like brand new. And like with Lisa, for example, I mean, I think she's like the perfect encapsulation of this. Like we look at the way her character is presented, and like, you know, there's a clear attempt to make her like a badass, like strong, like independent female character. And I mean, it doesn't really pan out. Like, there's a lot of, like, ogling of her body, and there's a lot of, like, just some comments that really, like, rub you the wrong way. And then she gets a few, like, cool moments, like, when she takes out that zombie. But, like, overall, like, the hype, like, she can't really back up the hype as far as, like, being, like, kind of this action-y character. You know, part of that is just, like, a side effect of, like, nobody really brings the hype but Joseph Joestar in this. But the other thing, too, is just that, when I actually can't remember if I saw this interview. This might just be hearsay. But the intention, apparently, was to, give her, like, a bigger role and, like, try to make an active effort to, like, make a better, like, female character than maybe he had in the past. And that was a controversial move because, you know, this was written back in the 80s, and the environment of Shonen Jump, the magazine, looked a lot different, and the editors were a lot more strict. They didn't want, basically, like, they had this really sexist attitude, the editors, of, like, we don't want any girl things in our like, manga presenting, like, our boy, like, readership, like, will, like, not like that, so keep it all out. So, like, that's the thing I appreciate about Araki, I guess, and that in kind of the insular, like, very particular, like, culture of anime and manga production, like, he always makes an attempt to try and be a little bit more worldly, like, take influences from, like, different places. And I think that's just part of what makes the series so unique. And, you know, granted, not saying that this attempt always turns out well, as we can see from our wacky adventures with the Nazis here, it certainly falls flat on its face quite a bit. But, you know, when it comes to the often regressive world of anime and manga, the fact that he takes those kind of risks, like tries to do something a little different, like outside of what's expected of him. I mean, it's a good mindset to have, I think, for an author.
Then with Jackson's continuous praise for JoJo amidst his criticisms,
my love letter to JoJo,
part 2.
marry me, Hirohiko Araki.
Yeah, part 2. Who knows? There might be a part 3 at some point if Jackson manages to coax me into watching 2 more seasons of this show.
Yes, if you enjoyed this episode, JoJo fans, please comment. Please let us know. If I can wheedle Sean into doing part 3 and beyond, I would be just thrilled.
We'll see. It's going to take some coaxing.
Part 3 is very long, to be fair.
With that, though, I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me at Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I'm also streaming Twitch every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please do me a huge favor and go follow me. It helps me out a great deal, and once I hit 50 followers, I'm going to be streaming some Kingdom Hearts for the first time ever, which should be an interesting experience as someone who has never played it.
And I am Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at JacksonJKeller, where I have a lengthy archive of JoJo opinions. I'd promise more, but unfortunately, I'm pretty much caught up on this series, so my takes aren't as hot and fresh as they used to be.
As always, we'd like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. Quick reminder, we will be recording every other week from now on, at least for a little while. We might return at a later date, no promises. With that in mind, in 2 weeks, we will be talking about the first Godfather movie, a giant hole in both of our film experiences, as neither of us have ever seen it. So tune in for that, and we'll talk to you then.